I was reconciling my own checkbook by hand, an old habit from 40 years behind a teller's counter, when my insurance agent called to ask, carefully and a little apologetically, whether I had recently requested a change to my policy's beneficiary designations. I remember setting my pen down slowly, the checkbook still open to that week's entries, right before her question rearranged the entire shape of that afternoon. I had made no such request, not once in any conversation with anyone, and within the following week, I would learn that my daughter-in-law had contacted my insurance company directly, attempting to redirect a portion of my grandchildren's inheritance to her own children from a previous marriage, using documents that included a signature the claims department's own verification process had correctly flagged as inconsistent with mine. I would spend that week working with the company's fraud department, then with my own attorney, to make certain that attempt could never happen again. My name is Marceline Ashgrove. I'm 71 years old. I spent 41 years as a bank teller, the kind of career that teaches you to notice the smallest inconsistency on a form before anyone else in the room does. And teaches you, too, that a signature carries a specific weight that cannot simply be approximated by someone who didn't actually write it. My husband Foster died 14 years ago, a sudden blood clot after a long overseas flight, the kind of ordinary travel day that gave no warning at all. I remember picking him up at the airport, genuinely relieved he was finally home, and watching him collapse in the parking garage less than 10 minutes later. Grief that arrives in the middle of an ordinary homecoming teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the sound of an airport announcement can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep living anyway, because the alternative is letting the fear of sudden loss control every decision you make going forward. Foster's death taught me something else as well, watching how quickly a family's financial security could be upended by something entirely unexpected. Within a year, I took out a substantial life insurance policy on my own life, naming my grandchildren directly as beneficiaries rather than routing the proceeds through my own estate, specifically so that whatever happened to me, they would be protected immediately and directly, without delay or complication. I have 2 children. Weldon, my son, is 46, a pharmacist, married for 6 years to a woman named Maricela Bexley, 39, whose own 2 children from a previous marriage he has raised as his own since they wed, and who has always had a particular gift for making her own family's financial interests sound like simple fairness. I used to find it quietly amusing watching Weldon build his own career around double-checking every prescription against a doctor's original order, understanding, even then, that he'd absorbed exactly the same instinct toward verification I'd spent my own career practicing, though it would take this particular situation to reveal how much more selectively he'd learned to apply that instinct at home. Maricela grew up in a family that treated financial planning as something to be quietly managed, rather than openly discussed, the kind of household where important decisions happened behind closed doors and were presented to everyone else only once they'd already been finalized. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's comfort with quiet financial maneuvering comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep accepting that maneuvering indefinitely, especially once it starts targeting your own grandchildren's actual inheritance. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Weldon, back when we still spoke easily and often about her own parents quietly changing her childhood home's title without ever discussing it with her or her siblings until after the fact, believing the actual decision was theirs alone to make, regardless of how it eventually affected everyone else. My parents always said kids didn't need to understand the details, just the outcome, she told me. I grew up believing that important financial decisions simply happened somewhere above you, and that asking too many questions about the process itself wasn't really anyone's place. I remember thinking at the time that it explained a certain guardedness in her, worthy of real compassion. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire model of financial decision making built around quiet unilateral action, and that I would eventually become the person that model was applied to without my own consent. Foster and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company for nearly 30 years, meticulous with every file, the kind of man who double-checked a policy's fine print 3 times, simply because he understood exactly what happened to a family when something got overlooked. When I told him, 5 years into our marriage, that I wanted to pursue a full banking career rather than stay comfortable working part-time at the local branch, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with 2 small children at home. He told me he'd handle every school pickup and every dinner on my longest training weeks, and he did for years without complaint. I built my own career slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built. One carefully verified transaction at a time, 41 years behind the counter, until I finally retired, with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young colleague early in my career, a woman convinced she'd never develop enough confidence to catch a genuinely sophisticated forgery, whom I spent an entire year quietly mentoring after our shared shifts, never once mentioning to the branch manager how much extra time it actually required. She went on to run fraud prevention training for the entire regional bank system. And years later, a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let her give up on her own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding exactly how much that particular instinct would eventually matter within my own family, long before I ever imagined needing it there. My daughter, Prudence, is 43, an accountant, 3 time zones away, sharp and exacting in exactly the way you'd hope an accountant's judgment would be. She calls every Sunday evening, without fail, a habit that started the year Foster died and never once lapsed since. Between Weldon and Prudence, I have 4 grandchildren. Weldon's 2 biological children from his own marriage to Maricela, and Prudence's 2 children from her own marriage. Maricella's own 2 children from her previous marriage, Dash and Corinne, are not my biological grandchildren, though I have always treated them with exactly the same warmth and inclusion I extend to everyone else in this family, inviting them to every holiday, remembering every birthday, genuinely loving them as part of our lives. When I first took out that policy 14 years ago, I met with my own attorney, a sharp, longtime professional acquaintance named Odalis Ferrer, whom I'd worked alongside during several estate matters at the bank over the years. Naming grandchildren directly as beneficiaries is trickier than people assume, she told me. It protects them from probate delays, but it also means the designation itself becomes the entire legal reality, regardless of what anyone later believes should be fair. Keep your own documentation meticulous and never let anyone else handle that paperwork on your behalf. I thanked her and left her office determined to follow that advice completely. I signed the original policy documents myself at my own kitchen table. Weldon and Prudence, both still in their 20s at the time, neither of them married yet, reading through the beneficiary language with me before I finalized anything. I want you both to understand exactly what this protects. I told them, not just money, a promise that whatever happens to me, your own children will never be left waiting on anyone else's paperwork. They both promised they understood, and I believed them completely, having no reason at the time to imagine that promise would eventually be tested by someone neither of them had even met yet. My own days since retiring had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm, coffee at my own kitchen table most mornings, an hour or two reconciling my own accounts out of habit more than necessity, the occasional call from a former colleague looking to catch up. It was, by most measures, a peaceful life. one I'd built carefully in the years since Foster died, and one that made an ordinary Tuesday phone call from my insurance agent feel, at first, like nothing more than a routine policy check-in. Weldon met Maricela at his own pharmacy, where she came in regularly picking up prescriptions for Dash, who had a minor chronic condition requiring careful monthly management. I remember the first time Weldon brought her by my house, watching her ask thoughtful, specific questions about Foster's old insurance career. Questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than polite small talk. And I remember thinking, watching that first visit, how naturally she seemed to fit into a family that valued careful attention to detail. I would think about that first visit considerably more in a different light once I understood exactly how selectively that same careful attention eventually got applied. I remember Weldon and Maricela's own wedding vividly, standing near the back of a small backyard ceremony, watching Dash and Corinne serve as ring bearer and flower girl, genuinely delighted to be part of the day, and feeling real hope that afternoon that this blended family might grow into something wonderfully whole for everyone involved. For the first several years after Weldon married Maricela, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Maricela speaking warmly about wanting all the children in this blended family to feel equally secure and equally loved. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was about a year ago, when Maricela mentioned, almost as an aside during a family dinner, that it seemed like an oversight that my policy hadn't been updated since before Dash and Corinne came into the family, framing the existing designation as an accidental exclusion rather than a considered decision I'd made deliberately with my own attorney years before I'd ever met either of them. I sat with that comment for a long moment, understanding immediately that she had just proposed treating a carefully considered legal document as a casual oversight. Though I told myself in that moment that she simply didn't yet understand how deliberate that original decision had actually been. The second incident happened when Maricela began asking me, with increasing regularity, detailed questions about my own financial paperwork, framing her curiosity as simple concern for my organizational well-being as I aged. Though I noticed the questions consistently circled back to the specific insurance policy rather than my finances more broadly. I answered her questions honestly, but began quietly keeping my own copies of every document considerably more carefully organized than I had before. The third incident happened when I discovered, entirely by accident, that Maricela had contacted Odalis's own office directly, asking for a copy of my existing estate planning documents, claiming she was helping me organize things and had simply misplaced her own copy of materials I'd never actually given her in the first place. Odalis, appropriately cautious, declined to release anything without my own direct authorization and called me immediately afterward to confirm what had happened. I had to think carefully in that moment about how deliberately someone had begun trying to access documents that were never theirs to access at all. The fourth incident happened when I overheard Weldon and Maricela discussing, in their own kitchen during a visit, whether it might be time to have a broader conversation about updating my will and policy to reflect the family as it actually existed now, framing the conversation as something they intended to raise with me directly, though I noticed considerable urgency in Maricela's own tone that felt disproportionate to a conversation that hadn't happened yet. I mentioned to Weldon gently that I found the growing focus on my own financial documents increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Maricela simply worried a great deal about fairness for her own children, and that surely it didn't really matter exactly how often the topic came up. The fifth incident happened during a family gathering when Maricela mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd been in touch with an insurance representative herself, just to understand the general process for updating a beneficiary designation. in case I ever wanted help handling the paperwork myself. Marceline, you understand, right? She said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. It's not about pressuring you. It's just easier to have the information ready. I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law describe researching how to alter a legal document that governed my own grandchildren's direct inheritance, as though gathering that information on my behalf, without my request, was simple helpfulness rather than something considerably more concerning. I told her plainly that I preferred to handle any future paperwork through my own attorney directly, the same way I always had, and watched her expression flicker briefly before she agreed easily, a little too easily, in a way I understood only much later. The sixth incident happened when Maricella's own mother, meeting me at a holiday gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter handle blended family finances with such thoughtful fairness. She's always had that gift, she said, beaming, for making sure every child in a family gets treated the same. I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else directly, though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular unease of understanding that a narrative was being built around me that I had never actually agreed to. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something more directly and didn't. It happened when I mentioned to Weldon, plainly, that I intended to keep my existing policy exactly as it was, that Dash and Corinne were loved deeply in this family, but that the specific financial provision I'd made 14 years earlier had been a considered decision I wasn't planning to revisit. He told me he understood completely and would make sure Maricela understood as well. I believed him, not yet realizing that understanding and acting accordingly were about to become two very different things in this particular situation. The eighth incident happened when Weldon mentioned, in passing, that Maricela had recently signed up for an online legal document service, describing it as something she'd found useful for organizing household paperwork in general. I remember feeling a small, specific unease at that detail, though I couldn't yet articulate exactly why, and it would only be weeks later, once the actual fraud attempt surfaced, that I understood precisely what that particular subscription had likely been used for. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment something feels wrong. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Maricela is just anxious about her own children's security. Weldon loves me, even if he doesn't correct her firmly enough. She would never actually act without my knowledge, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that my own carefully documented wishes had become something someone else felt entitled to quietly revise. There was one afternoon, about a month before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to addressing this more directly. Maricela mentioned, during an ordinary phone call, that she'd found a simple form online that made updating a beneficiary designation considerably easier than people assumed, and that she'd be happy to help me fill it out whenever I felt ready. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface. Very close to finally saying, out loud, exactly how uncomfortable this pattern had become. Then I thought about Weldon's own happiness, about how much he loved his blended family, about how a direct confrontation might feel like an attack on Dash and Corinne themselves, rather than on the actual behavior concerning me. I let the comment pass and told myself, one more time, that the moment to address it fully hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came the call from my insurance agent. My agent, a careful woman named Priscilla Nakamura, who had handled my policy for over a decade, called on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Her own voice carrying a practiced carefulness I recognized immediately from years of handling sensitive financial conversations myself. Marceline, she said, I wanted to speak with you directly before proceeding with anything. Our office received a request last week to modify your beneficiary designations, submitted with your signature. But our verification process flagged some inconsistencies compared to the signature we have on file. I wanted to confirm directly with you before taking any further action. I set my pen down slowly, the checkbook still open on the table in front of me. Priscilla, I said carefully, I made no such request. Can you tell me exactly what was submitted? She described the request in detail, a modification reducing my actual grandchildren's shares and redirecting a substantial portion to two names I didn't recognize as my own designated beneficiaries at all, though I recognized them immediately as Maricella's own children from her previous marriage. I need you to treat this as a fraudulent submission, I told her, my own training from decades behind a teller's window rising up instinctively. Please flag the account, decline the modification entirely, and direct me to whatever formal reporting process your company has for this kind of situation. Priscilla confirmed she would do exactly that, and explained that the company's own fraud department would likely follow up with additional questions given the seriousness of an attempted unauthorized modification to a life insurance policy. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat at my own kitchen table for a long time afterward, understanding with a clarity that arrived all at once exactly what I needed to do next. I called my old friend Bettina before I called my attorney, a woman I'd worked alongside for over 2 decades at the same bank branch, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how seriously a forged signature actually needed to be treated. I told her the whole story, months of gradual pressure, the unauthorized document request, and now the actual fraud department's own call. She listened without interrupting, her own coffee going cold in front of her. Marceline, she finally said, you spent 41 years teaching younger tellers that a mismatched signature is never nothing, that it's always worth stopping the transaction to verify properly. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the signature in question happens to be your own. I keep waiting to feel like I'm overreacting, I told her, and it isn't coming. Maybe it isn't coming, Bettina said, because you're not overreacting. Someone tried to forge your name on a legal document affecting your own grandchildren's inheritance. That's not a misunderstanding to smooth over. That's exactly the kind of thing you spent your entire career refusing to let slide. I called Dallas immediately, the same attorney who had drafted my original policy documentation, and understood exactly what protection I'd built into it 14 years earlier. I explained the pattern plainly, months of gradual pressure, the unauthorized document request from her own office, and now an actual attempted forgery submitted directly to my insurance company. Marceline, she said, this moves well beyond an uncomfortable family conversation. Attempting to submit a forged signature to alter a life insurance beneficiary designation is a serious matter, both civilly and potentially criminally, regardless of the family relationship involved. Let's document everything properly and let's discuss exactly how you want to proceed. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do because I think it matters. I did not act out of spite, and I did not seek criminal prosecution as my first response. Dallas and I first confirmed, through the insurance company's own fraud department, exactly what had been submitted and by whom, obtaining formal documentation of the attempted fraudulent modification. I then had Dallas draft a formal letter to Weldon and Maricela directly, explaining precisely what had occurred, requiring written acknowledgement of the incident and specifying that any further attempt to access or alter my financial documents without my direct, verified authorization would result in a formal police report and potential civil action. I sent that letter through her office with the fraud department's own documentation attached. The same plain, serious language that could have applied to any attempted financial fraud between any two parties anywhere in the state. Weldon called the following morning, his voice tight with shock rather than his usual calm. Mom, Maricela is telling me this is a misunderstanding, that she was just trying to help move the process along and didn't realize there was anything wrong with the paperwork. I understand that's difficult to hear, I said calmly, but someone submitted a document with a signature that wasn't mine, attempting to redirect a portion of your own children's inheritance to different beneficiaries entirely without ever asking me directly. That isn't a misunderstanding, Weldon. That's exactly the kind of situation my insurance company's own verification process exists to catch. There has to be some explanation that doesn't involve deliberate fraud. I'm genuinely open to hearing one, I said, but it needs to come with a clear accounting of exactly how that document was prepared and submitted and by whom. I'm not interested in destroying this family over this. I'm interested in making absolutely certain nothing like it can ever happen again. Maricela called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Marceline, this is being blown completely out of proportion. I was only trying to help move a conversation forward that Weldon and I had already discussed with you. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who received a call from her own insurance agent because someone submitted a document attempting to forge my signature and redirect my actual grandchildren's inheritance. I think the real question is where that specific document came from and who believed submitting it without my knowledge was an acceptable way to move a conversation forward. I didn't forge anything. I don't know exactly what happened with that paperwork. Then I trust you'll cooperate fully with my attorney's request for a clear accounting of how it was prepared, I said. Because right now, an insurance company's own fraud department has flagged this as a serious documented incident. And that isn't something either of us gets to simply reframe as a misunderstanding. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then went back to my own kitchen table, understanding that whatever came next would take considerable time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Weldon called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's insistence that this had all been innocent and a growing understanding of exactly how serious the actual documentation suggested it had been. Prudence, once she heard the whole story, offered to fly in and help me navigate the fraud department's own follow-up process, walking through every detail with the same careful precision she brought to reconciling a difficult set of accounts. She sat with me at my own kitchen table for an entire weekend, cross-referencing dates, timestamps, and every document Odalis had gathered, building a clean, organized timeline that made the actual pattern impossible to dismiss as a single lapse in judgment. I don't think Weldon understood how systematic it actually was until he saw it laid out chronologically, Prudence told me later. He kept saying, I thought that was just one conversation about fairness. It wasn't one conversation, Mom. It was months of them, building toward exactly this. About 2 weeks after my formal letter went out, Weldon asked if I'd be willing to sit down with him and Maricela together, along with Odalis present, before anything proceeded further toward a formal police report. I agreed, genuinely hoping we could establish exactly what had happened without permanently fracturing this family. When the meeting began, Weldon sat across from me at Odalis's own conference table, Maricela beside him, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. Mom, Weldon began, we wanted to sit down properly and figure out what actually happened here. I'm listening, I said. Maricela spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. I found an online form and filled it out myself, using information I already had access to from helping around the house. And I signed your name because I genuinely believed I was just moving along a change we'd already discussed as a family. I know now that was wrong, but I never meant for it to be treated as an actual crime. I considered that admission carefully before responding. Signing someone else's name on a legal financial document without their knowledge or authorization and submitting it to an insurance company is the textbook definition of forgery and attempted fraud, regardless of intention. I understand you may not have set out planning to commit a crime, but that's precisely what the document you submitted actually constituted. I could lose Weldon's trust in me entirely over this, Maricela said, her composure cracking. Is that really what you wanted? What I wanted, I said, was for my own carefully documented wishes to remain exactly that, mine, until I chose to change them myself, through the same careful process I originally used to establish them. I never once asked you to manage that process on my behalf. I only asked repeatedly and clearly that my own decisions be respected as final. Weldon was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned toward Maricela directly, his voice low but clear enough for Adalis and me both to hear. You signed my mother's name on a legal document, he said. That's not a fairness conversation gone slightly wrong. That's something else entirely, and I need you to understand the difference before we can move forward from this at all. Maricela's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire meeting, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. I don't know how to fix something I let fear about my own children's security turn into, she said, almost to herself. You start by fully cooperating with whatever accountability this actually requires, I told her, legally and otherwise. I spent considerable time that same week weighing whether formal prosecution was actually the right path forward, sitting with Adalis through a long, careful conversation about what each option would actually mean for this family going forward. I don't want to destroy two children's relationship with their own mother over this, I told her, but I also can't simply pretend it didn't happen. Odalis helped me understand that a formal, documented diversion process could achieve genuine accountability without necessarily requiring the most severe outcome available, provided Maricela's cooperation was complete and immediate. Given Maricela's full cooperation, her formal written acknowledgement of exactly what she had done, and her agreement to complete a court diversion financial literacy and ethics program rather than face formal charges, Odalis and I agreed not to pursue criminal prosecution, though the incident remained formally documented with both the insurance company and my own attorney's office, permanently establishing the record of what had actually occurred. About 3 weeks later, Weldon came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about how completely I failed to take your discomfort seriously months ago, he said, when you first mentioned finding the questions about your paperwork uncomfortable. I told myself Maricela just worried a lot, and I never once stopped to ask whether that worry had already crossed a line. He paused, looking down at his own hands. I keep thinking about how you used to let me sit with you at the bank sometimes after school, watching you catch mistakes other tellers missed entirely. I don't know when I stopped applying that same standard to my own home. Thank you for saying that now, I told him. Why didn't I take it seriously sooner, he asked, mostly to himself. You told me directly, more than once, and I still didn't act. Because you wanted to believe the people you love wouldn't actually cross a line like that, I said gently. That's not a foolish thing to want. It's simply not the same thing as verifying that they haven't. Maricela called her own mother that same autumn, correcting, at last, the impression she'd left at that earlier holiday gathering. Weldon told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered whether the story of thoughtful fairness had been entirely accurate. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Weldon's or Maricella's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a picture of the family situation she'd simply accepted without ever asking directly. Maricela completed her financial ethics program that spring and came to see me on her own once it concluded, considerably more subdued than our earlier confrontation had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually facing criminal charges and what that would have meant for Dash and Corinne, watching their own mother go through something like that, she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Marceline, but some part of this fear was just about genuinely wanting my own children to have the same security your biological grandchildren already had guaranteed. That fear is entirely understandable, I told her gently. I never wanted Dash and Corinne to feel less secure in this family. I only ever wanted my own actual decisions about my own actual assets to remain mine to make through an honest process rather than something quietly altered on my behalf. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted, about how easily wanting security for my own children turned into believing I was entitled to simply arrange that security myself without ever properly asking. I think I convinced myself that asking directly risked a no I couldn't bear to hear, so I found a way around asking at all. You were never entitled to bypass me, Maricela, I told her, but you were always entitled to ask me directly, honestly, about what genuine security for Dash and Corinne might actually look like within the boundaries I'm comfortable with. Those are very different paths, and only one of them was ever available to you. I don't know how to undo what I did, she said. You don't undo forgery, I told her. You account for it fully, which you have, and then you spend considerable time afterward proving, through small, consistent honesty, that you understand exactly why it mattered as much as it did. Can I ask you something? She said. Did you ever actually consider including Dash and Corinne before any of this happened? Honestly, I said, I hadn't fully considered it, the same way you hadn't fully considered simply asking me directly. I think we both have some things to examine about that. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon about Foster, about the original decision behind that policy, about what genuine, honest inclusion might actually look like going forward. I told her that I was willing to have an honest conversation with my own attorney about establishing a separate, smaller provision specifically for Dash and Corinne, funded independently rather than by reducing my actual grandchildren's existing shares, provided that conversation happened through the same careful, documented process I'd always used, with full transparency from everyone involved. Maricela listened carefully, her hands folded in her lap, before thanking me, genuinely, for even considering it after everything that had happened. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Weldon and Maricela began seeing a financial counselor together that autumn, specifically to address the underlying anxiety that had driven her toward such a serious lapse in judgment, something neither of them had properly examined before. Maricela told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken fear underlying their approach to blending two families financially. We both said, scarcity, almost at the same time, Maricela said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called fairness actually stemmed from a fear that there simply wasn't enough security to go around honestly. I called Odalis a few weeks after the initial meeting to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the family's own accountability process had moved forward faster than either of us expected. Marceline, I've handled a lot of these situations over the years, she said, and I can tell you, what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined responses to attempted financial fraud I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt, in the moment, more like an act of pure alarm than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You understood from the moment you established that policy 14 years ago exactly how easily a family's own security can be quietly undermined if the documentation isn't treated with total seriousness. The fact that you eventually needed to enforce that seriousness doesn't make you any less careful for having built it properly in the first place. Prudence flew in for Thanksgiving that year, the first time in years that both of my children had gathered under one roof at once. My own dining room filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed at any family gathering in longer than I cared to admit. Weldon and Maricela drove over with a pie Maricela had made herself. No elaborate presentation, just a slightly uneven crust. She laughed about setting down on my counter, Dash and Corinne, helping carry dishes in, behind her, with genuine warmth. Over dinner, Prudence's husband Osric asked, innocently enough, how the whole situation had eventually settled, clearly having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Maricela simply said, I let fear about my own children's security turn into something I'm not proud of. And Marceline handled it with more grace than I honestly deserved. We're working on doing this honestly now, together. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Osric, genuinely curious rather than unkind, asked Maricela how it had felt, realizing the seriousness of what she'd done. Maricela was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. Terrifying isn't a strong enough word, she said. I think I finally understood what it costs everyone when you let fear talk you into a shortcut you'd never actually accept from anyone else. I appreciated that she didn't try to soften the admission for the sake of a pleasant holiday table. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving, a card arrived in my mailbox. Weldon's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Maricela's anxiety go unaddressed instead of taking your own discomfort seriously the first time you mentioned it. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actually listen the moment you tell me something feels wrong from now on, rather than assuming it will simply resolve itself. Thank you for handling something this serious with more patience than I think I would have managed myself. Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Maricela's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. Marceline, I let fear turn into something genuinely dangerous, and I'm still working to understand fully what that could have cost this entire family. Thank you for handling it in a way that gave me the chance to actually make it right, instead of simply losing everything. I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside the original fraud department documentation I'd kept from that first difficult week, next to an old photograph of Foster at his own desk, poring over a claims file the same careful way he approached everything he took seriously. I think he would have recognized exactly what those notes meant, and I think he would have been quietly satisfied that the same careful vigilance he'd practiced his entire career had eventually protected exactly what it was meant to. Odalis and I finalized the separate, independently funded provision for Dash and Corinne that following spring, established through an entirely new, properly documented process, with Maricela present throughout every step, watching honestly and transparently exactly how a legitimate financial decision actually gets made. She thanked me afterward, quietly, for showing her what the honest version of the security she'd wanted for her own children could actually look like. I called Priscilla directly that same spring, once everything had been properly resolved, to thank her for taking her own verification process seriously enough to call me before proceeding with anything. Marceline, she told me, I've been in this business for over 15 years, and I can tell you most people never actually get that call because most fraud attempts aren't quite as careless as this one turned out to be. Your own instincts about signatures and ours happened to align perfectly this time. I told her I appreciated more than she probably realized exactly how much that alignment had actually protected. I saw my own longtime friend Bettina again that spring, over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd talked through everything the week the fraud department first called. I told her about the resolution, the counseling, the new honest provision. Bettina listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. I told you it would matter, catching that discrepancy the moment you noticed it, she said. Most people don't take something like that seriously enough, even when their own instincts are practically shouting at them. You did, and look what it actually protected. Not just the policy, the whole family's honesty going forward. I thought about that phrase for days afterward, understanding that it described exactly what had actually been at stake the whole time. Do you regret any of it? Bettina asked gently, reporting it as formally as you did. I don't regret any of it, I told her. I regret that it took an actual attempted forgery for any of us to have an honest conversation about what security genuinely means in a blended family. I think I needed that alarm in some strange way to finally understand exactly what my own careful documentation had been protecting all along. I think about that phone call from Priscilla often, my own checkbook still open on the kitchen table, her careful voice explaining exactly what had been flagged. At the moment, it felt like the beginning of something frightening. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something considerably more honest. A family finally required to reckon directly with a fear it had been quietly acting on instead of naming. I don't regret establishing that policy the way I did 14 years ago. Protecting my grandchildren directly and immediately mattered to me then, and it still does now. What I regret is how long I allowed the small, uncomfortable signs of encroachment to go unaddressed before I finally insisted the record reflect what I had actually decided. Real financial security was never meant to require quiet manipulation to achieve, and I intend to make certain every decision I make about my own assets remains genuinely mine through an honest process for as long as I'm able to make it. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet discomfort was something to simply manage privately rather than something requiring a firm, immediate response. I no longer believe that. Tolerating small encroachments in silence isn't patience. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of vulnerability, and it costs exactly as much in the end whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how much damage accumulates before you finally do. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The dinner table comment about an oversight, the pointed questions about my paperwork, the unauthorized request to my own attorney's office. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that the eventual forgery was an isolated lapse rather than the culmination of months of careful, escalating access seeking. Maricela may not have set out from the very beginning intending fraud specifically, but the cumulative pattern moved in exactly that direction, regardless of when the specific intention crystallized, and pretending otherwise would only make the next family's version of the story more likely, not less. Real financial protection, I've come to believe, depends entirely on treating your own careful documentation with the same seriousness you'd want anyone else to treat it with, refusing to let anyone reframe deliberate legal decisions as casual oversights simply because reframing them feels more comfortable in the moment. If a family member needs you to treat your own considered financial decisions as endlessly revisable based on their own preferences, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves an immediate, direct response, not a patient wait and see approach. I think of it now the way I used to think about a customer at my own teller's window, presenting a check with a signature that didn't quite match our records. You can wave it through if you want to, telling yourself it's probably nothing. It's never actually nothing. It's simply a problem, waiting for someone finally willing to look closely enough to catch it. I think sometimes about all those years behind that teller's window, learning that every honest transaction depends on verifying exactly what a signature actually represents before you ever process what it authorizes. It took me 71 years and one very serious phone call from my own insurance agent to apply that same standard fully to my own family. I established that policy freely, and I would establish it exactly the same way again. But I no longer accept quiet erosion of my own documented decisions as simply the price of keeping peace in a blended family. If I am the one who decided, carefully and deliberately, exactly how my own assets should protect my own grandchildren, I intend to remain the one making that decision, not because I distrust everyone who loves me, but because pretending vigilance was ever unnecessary was never actually true. The family gathers at my own house most Sundays now, a habit that started that same spring. Simple dinners with no particular occasion required. Maricela always asks me directly now about even small financial decisions that happen to come up in conversation, whether a particular approach actually reflects what I've decided, rather than assuming any decision remains open for revision on her own initiative. Prudence flew in specially for one of those dinners that first spring, standing near my own kitchen doorway with genuine warmth on her face, watching Maricela ask me, plainly, whether a particular charitable contribution I'd mentioned actually reflected my own final decision before she said anything further about it to anyone else. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of a year. I am 71 years old, a widow, a retired bank teller, a mother and grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly tolerates small, uncomfortable encroachments on her own carefully documented decisions, while telling herself the people making them surely mean no real harm. That particular version of me stayed behind in an ordinary Tuesday phone call from my own insurance agent, along with a forged signature that nobody in this family will ever quite forget having to account for. I sat down at my own kitchen table that afternoon as one woman, and I stood back up as another. And I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day I first established that policy 14 years ago, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would establish it exactly the same way again, because protecting my grandchildren directly was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming that careful documentation alone would naturally deter anyone determined enough to try circumventing it. That 14 years of clearly stated intentions could survive on their own weight without anyone occasionally insisting they be respected directly. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the policy I established. It would be the months of small, uncomfortable signs I let slide, signs I mistook again and again for ordinary family anxiety, rather than what they actually were. The early stages of a serious, deliberate attempt to quietly rewrite my own decisions without my consent. Dash, 15 and old enough to understand most of what had actually happened, asked me directly during that same visit whether I'd been angry at his mom for what she'd tried to do. I told him honestly that I had been, and that being angry and still loving someone were not mutually exclusive things. a lesson I hoped he'd carry with him longer than the specific incident itself. Corinne, younger and less certain of the full details, simply asked whether this meant she still got to call me Grandma Marceline, a question that struck me considerably harder than anything the adults in this situation had said to me in months. Of course you do, I told her. That was never actually in question, not for one single day of this. Dash and Corinne's own new provision was finalized properly that spring, and both of them, old enough now to understand at least the basic shape of what had happened, thanked me themselves with genuine warmth for including them honestly rather than through whatever their own mother had originally attempted. I told them, honestly, that being included the right way had always mattered more to me than being included quickly, and that I hoped they'd remember that difference themselves someday, in whatever families they eventually built of their own. Prudence's own children ask me sometimes, whenever the subject of family finances comes up naturally in conversation, why Grandma is always so particular about paperwork and signatures. I tell them the truth, unhurried and complete, that a signature is a promise, that promises deserve to be verified rather than simply assumed, and that the family they're growing up in learned that lesson the hard way. Once, so that hopefully none of them ever has to learn it that way themselves. These days, when anyone in this family discusses financial decisions, the actual process gets followed properly. Every single time. Documentation reviewed honestly. Direct conversations had plainly no quiet shortcuts taken on anyone's behalf without their full knowledge. I'm simply, finally, exactly as certain of my own authority over my own decisions as I always should have been.